When you think of 90s metal production, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For lots of us, it's the sound of a wall of guitars hitting 2-inch tape. It's the colossal polished punch of Metallica's Black Album, which took everything that was done in the 80s and refined it and set a standard for the 90s. Or it's the raw aggression of Vulgar Display of Power, or the world-changing angst of Nevermind. It was an era that produced some of the most iconic records of all time, and it's really easy to look back on it like it was some absolute golden age where everyone was on the same page with this unified summit of sound. So with all that legendary output, did metal production actually peak in the 1990s? I've been a producer and a guitarist in my band Dust since 1999, so I came up right at the tail end of this incredible decade trying to get some of those same sounds myself. I remember trying to dig up info on how my favorite records were made and finding zero. I had to figure it out for myself through trial and error, mostly error. And I'm here to tell you my take on it. Did it peak? Nope. It was a decade of awkward digital adolescence and sonic compromises we'd never accept today. But here's the key. Even if it wasn't a peak, I consider it more like the Big Bang. It was an explosive, messy, and brilliant moment of creation that laid the complete technical and artistic groundwork for everything that's come since. Think about it. We wouldn't have Gojira, the Black Dahlia Murder, and Periphery without bands like Meshuggah, Carcass, Fear Factory, and At the Gates. But to really understand the 90s sound, you have to understand the chaotic collision of two worlds, analog and digital. For most of the decade, and for virtually all high-budget productions, the heart of the Pro Studio was 2-inch magnetic tape, run through massive analog consoles like SSL and Neve. This wasn't just a recording medium, it was an instrument. Pushing signals hot onto tape gave you a lot of natural compression and harmonic saturation, which was that glue that producers consider the holy grail. I mean, they're still chasing it today, but back then it was a really physical process. You could feel the heat coming off the console. You could hear the giant reels of tape spinning up to speed. The workflow was also manual and incredibly unforgiving. Editing literally meant taking a razor blade to your master tape. There was no undo button. This put a premium on performance. Bands had to be exceptionally well rehearsed because studio time and tape were expensive, but the result was a sound that's rooted in human feel. The subtle ways a drummer would push or pull against the beat weren't mistakes to be corrected by a grid. They were the groove, the soul of the performance. But while big bands were on 2-inch tape, there was a revolution happening in basement and project studios, and it was called ADAT. The Osiris digital audio tape machine gave you 8 tracks of digital audio on a cheap SVHS videotape. And for the first time ever, you could get pro track counts at home. For context, back in those days and before, most of us were stuck with 4-track Porta studios. ADAT was a massive, monumental leap forward. Its genius was its modularity. You could sync 2 or 3 machines together for 16 or 24 tracks, a count previously reserved for pro studios. This, combined with affordable and high-quality Mackie 8-bus mixers, launched the Project Studio boom. Suddenly, you didn't need a major label budget to make a full-sounding record. In fact, Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill, one of the biggest albums of the decade, was largely recorded on ADATs. Now, to be fair, the record was finished in a pro studio, but just the fact that the core elements were captured on ADATs was game-changing. And speaking of great mixes done with affordable gear, this video is brought to you by Nail the Mix. If you want to learn how to mix and master metal, Nail the Mix is the place to do it straight from the best. Mixers like Will Putney, Buster Odeholm, Jens Bogren, Nolly, TLA, David Bendeth, and artists such as Gojira, Meshuggah, Periphery, Opeth, Nickelback, and over 100 more. At the start of the month, we released the raw multi-tracks from the session so you can download them straight into your DAW and mix the song from scratch. Getting your hands on this kind of source material is an incredible learning opportunity, just so you can see what the standard really is like at this level. Then, at the end of the month, the mixer does a live stream where they break down exactly how they mixed it on the record and answers your questions live. You can also join our monthly mixing competition. Submit your mix, vote for your favorites, and win prizes like microphones, guitars, plugins, gear, and a lot more cool stuff. And your membership comes packed with extras. All the URM plugins, MixLab with over 150 tutorials, Riff Hard for guitarists, and access to our private community on Discord and Facebook. So if you're serious about leveling up your mixes and learning from the very best, check out nailthemix.com today. It's at the link in the description of this video. As badass as ADAT was, there was a trade-off. There was a sonic cost. Those early digital converters were often described as thin or brittle, and the 16-bit resolution just didn't have the depth of pro analog tape. The SHVHS tapes weren't designed for audio and were prone to digital dropouts. In short, they were a pain in the ass. This ultimately led to the hybrid studio, which became the dominant workflow moving forward. People would track the core instruments to 2-inch tape to get that analog warmth. I fucking hate that word, but You guys know what I mean. Then they would transfer it into an early DAW like Pro Tools to do all the heavy editing. Pro Tools wasn't a replacement for tape yet, but it was the ultimate editing tool. The ability to do non-linear editing and mix automation was game-changing. People could finally comp the perfect vocal take from a dozen different performances or program fader movements with a level of precision that was impossible on an analog console. It just wasn't possible. But this new digital world, like all technology, brought new problems with it. The shift from vinyl to CDs meant that the physical limits on volume were gone. A vinyl record could only be so loud before the needle would literally jump out of the groove during playback. The CD had a hard digital ceiling at 0 dBFS, which created a new imperative: be louder than the competition. That kicked off the loudness wars. Mastering engineers started using digital brick wall limiters to make tracks as loud as possible to grab the listener's attention, crushing dynamic range in the process. This constant battle between new technologies and new philosophies defined the decade. Let's take a look at some of the artists and subgenres that were born out of this chaos. First, you had the last gasp of 80s excess with Guns N' Roses' Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. They were released just weeks before Nevermind changed everything. These albums were a monument to what was possible with a virtually unlimited budget. They were an exercise in maximalism, using multiple synchronized multi-track machines along 2-inch tape to reach very, very high track counts. Slash famously layered dozens of guitar tracks for each song, while the arrangements were packed with grand pianos, horn sections, and choirs, especially on epics like November Rain. It was a bombastic, dense sound that stood as the final statement of a dying era. Now, in complete opposition to everything that the 80s looked like, sounded like, and stood for, there was grunge. At its heart, grunge was an anti-production movement. It was a middle finger to the reverb-drenched, hyper-polished sound of 80s hair metal. The goal was to capture the raw energy of a band in the room, embracing things like amp feedback and mic bleed as part of the sound. But authenticity was a moving target, and you could see those two extremes on two different records by the same band, Nirvana. On Nevermind, producer Butch Vig took that raw power and made it sound massive and clean enough for radio. He layered multiple guitar tracks, blending amps to create a huge wall of sound. He used the big ambient room at Sound City and a drum tunnel on the kick to get one of the most iconic drum sounds of all time. Then, for In Utero, the band hired Steve Albini, a purist who believed his job was just to create an accurate, unvarnished document of the band performing. The album is intentionally abrasive, raw, and dynamically wild. Both records were seen as authentic, which proves that Raw and Real was actually a carefully constructed sound achieved through differing philosophies. While grunge was taking over, there was a new breed of metal coming onto the scene. And these bands were shifting the focus from pure speed to rhythmic weight and groove. Pantera's vulgar display of power, produced by Terry Date, is the blueprint. The production was all about maximizing punch and impact. That's where that iconic scoop mid guitar tone became famous. It's not just about turning the mid knob to 0, it was a surgical production choice. By scooping a specific chunk out of the guitars, Terry Date created a sonic pocket that let the vocals sit clearly and allowed the kick and snare to punch through with maximum impact. It was a tool for separation, not just a recipe for heaviness. That extra heaviness was bonus. But what made it really, really effective is how the band's performances were built for that sound. Dimebag's percussive riffs were written to lock in with Vinnie Paul's huge groove-oriented drum parts, and Date's production emphasized every pick attack and every kick hit with almost mechanical precision. The arrangements left space for riffs and drums to breathe, making the impact even bigger when Phil's vocals would take over. It was a deliberate contrast to the ambient layered production that dominated the early 90s. Where the Black Album created its size through room sound, reverb, and really careful layering, Vulgar Display of Power went the opposite direction. It was dry, tight, and in your face, proving that heaviness heaviness could come from clarity and precision rather than sheer size. And that shift in philosophy is crucial because it redefined what heavy could sound like in the studio. It actually became the foundation for groove metal and beyond. Another landmark was Sepultura's KSAD, mixed by Andy Wallace. They slowed down their thrash roots and incorporated the raw, tribal intensity of New York hardcore, creating a sound that was both brutally heavy and incredibly groovy. A wave of other bands were also carving out their own distinct corners of heavy music. Typo Negative pioneered gothic metal's production aesthetic on records like Bloody Kisses. And side note, did you know that Bloody Kisses went platinum? Can you imagine a record like Bloody Kisses going platinum now? It pioneered this sound using cavernous reverb, layered choral-style vocals, and dense, almost symphonic guitar arrangements that created an atmosphere closer to a cathedral than a club. White Zombie with Astro Creep 2000 pushed production in yet another direction, fusing groove metal with industrial sampling, electronic loops, and experimental sound design, and it showed just how far metal production could stretch beyond just traditional instruments. And then you've got Danzig working with Rick Rubin, who went the other way again, stripping production down to its bare bones on albums like Danzig 3, How the Gods Kill. Rubin emphasized space, dryness, and blues-based heaviness, proving that restraint and minimalism could feel just as massive as layers of distortion. So just like grunge had split into two competing philosophies half a decade earlier, the rest of heavy music was now branching off into multiple directions. Some bands layered until the sound was symphonic, others embraced technology and experimentation, while some stripped everything back to the raw essentials. This tsunami of new approaches showed just how wide the definition of heavy had become in the 1990s. Alternative metal, or alt metal as it was called sometimes, became a catch-all banner for all of this experimentation, with bands like Rage Against the Machine and Tool blending punk, funk, and noise rock into their metal foundation. Festivals like Lollapalooza gave all these diverse sounds a massive platform, cementing the idea that there was no longer just one way metal could sound. But while the mainstream was finding its place and locking it in, there were these underground scenes that were pushing things even further in other directions. In Florida, studios like Morrisound with producer Scott Burns were pioneering the clinical precision of death metal. The music of bands like Death, Cannibal Corpse, and Morbid Angel was so fast and technical that clarity was essential. This is where drum triggers became a necessity. By blending a clean, consistent sample with the overhead mics, Burns could ensure every single note of a blast beat or a lightning-fast kick pattern was perfectly audible. But it was not just the drums. Guitar tones were a revolution of their own. Instead of the scoop mids of groove metal, death metal guitars often, but not always, kept more mid-range to preserve note definition and dense riffs. Producers relied on high-gain amps like the PV5150 or Mesa Dual Rec, but used tight EQ and careful double tracking to make sure tremolo-picked riffs did not collapse into noise. The bass guitar often mirrored the guitars for added weight, but Burns made sure it still had clarity in the low mids, so the mix had a solid foundation. Vocals were handled differently too. Thrash had shouted clarity, whereas death metal demanded guttural depth. Engineers leaned on compression and EQ to keep growls present without burying the instruments, usually keeping them dry and up front to maximize brutality. The philosophy at Morrisound was to create order from chaos. The bands were playing at extreme tempos with unmatched technicality, and the production had to translate that intensity without turning into mud. That clinical brutality became the global blueprint for death metal in the 90s. Lots of European bands either traveled to Florida to record or adapted the Morrisound approach at home. Speaking of Europe, at around the same time, there was a scene in Sweden that was pioneering their own kind of sound. At Sunlight Studios, producer Thomas Skosberg shaped albums by Entombed, Dismember, and Grave with a tone that could not have been further from Morrisound's precision. Instead of clinical clarity, Swedish death metal embraced raw, buzzing guitar tones created with Boss HM2 pedals, dimed out into solid-state amps. The result was the infamous chainsaw tone, heavy and completely overwhelming. Rather than separating every element, the mix collapsed guitars, bass, and drums into a single wall of noise that felt like it was recorded in a concrete bunker. Together, those two poles defined death metal production in the 1990s. Florida gave the world tight technical clarity, while Sweden gave us raw, atmospheric filth. Both approaches became iconic, and both approaches still influence producers today. Now, we can't talk about the 90s without talking about what was happening in Norway. I know that I've introduced all the different genres or scenes as taking things in a different direction, and it was all true, but I'm going to say it again because the second wave of Norwegian black metal was really taking things in its own direction. Bands like Mayhem and Darkthrone deliberately embraced a raw, cold, and lo-fi sound as an ideological statement against commercialism. The production was part of the art. Thin, tremolo pick guitars created a wall of sound, boxy-sounding drums cut through without polish, and the mix focused less on clarity and more on atmosphere. The goal was not to showcase technical ability. It was to summon an aura of darkness and hatred. For death metal, high production quality became essential to prove its precision and musicianship. For black metal, poor production quality became essential to prove its authenticity. The hiss of a cheap 4-track, the bleed of distant room mics, or the brittle edge of solid-state distortion were not flaws to be fixed. They were proof that the music was underground, untouchable by the mainstream, and therefore real. This was not the whole story with black metal because this was the 1990s. Things were going to change again. By the end of the decade, a different strain of Norwegian black metal was already pulling in the opposite direction. Bands like Emperor and Dimmu Borgir began using studios as instruments in their own right, layering choirs, synths, and orchestral elements to create these vast symphonic and high-fidelity soundscapes. The contrast between Darkthrone's frostbitten minimalism and Emperor's cinematic maximalism shows how wide the production spectrum of 1990s black metal had become. And behind all these sounds were the producers, the architects of the decade. And you can't talk about them without mentioning Andy Wallace, the undisputed king of mixing in the 90s. He mixed Nevermind, Chaos AD, Rage Against the Machine's debut, and so many others. Here's a technique that he helped popularize in rock and metal that you can use right away. Instead of just compressing his main drum bus, he would send the drums to several separate aux tracks. He'd absolutely smash one with an 1176 in all buttons in mode for aggression. He'd crush another for punch and sustain, and then blend those hyper-compressed signals back in underneath the main unprocessed drums. This adds insane energy and weight without squashing the natural dynamics of the original performance. It's actually a trick that guys on Nail the Mix still use constantly. He was also a master of using surgical EQ on an SSL console to create space, like boosting the punch frequency of a kick while making a corresponding narrow cut on the bass guitar to make them interlock perfectly. And over in the UK, you had Colin Richardson crafting a different kind of aggression with bands like Carcass, Fear Factory, and Machine Head. Colin was actually one of the first guys to ever share production tricks with me back in the day, and his approach to guitars, those were a game changer to me. His approach was less gain, more amp, pushing a high gain amp like a PV5150 to its limits rather than relying on a pedal for distortion. His guitar tones were rich in mid-range, which he believed was where the real power and pick attack lived. His focus on clarity and mid-range definition made sure that his mixes punched through even the densest arrangements. You can hear it not only on Carcass's Heartwork and Machine Head's Burn My Eyes, but also on Fear Factory's Demanufacturer, 3 albums that are often credited as the birth of modern metal tone. Richardson's precise, tight production was the perfect match for Fear Factory's fusion of death metal riffs, industrial machine rhythms, and clean and harsh vocal dynamics. The way he locked Dino's percussive guitar style to Raymond Herrera's triggered kick drums created a mechanical, almost cybernetic sound that redefined what tight could mean in metal. This blueprint became a direct influence on the next generation, laying the groundwork for gent and modern metalcore production. So what's the final verdict? In my humble opinion, the good parts of 90s production are undeniable. The human feel from real performances, the dynamic range before the loudness wars went nuclear, and the disciplined creativity that came from the limitations of analog tape. But there was also the bad. There was that awkward adolescence of digital audio, those brittle sounding converters and early ADATs, and primitive tools like the first amp sims that just couldn't compete with a real tube amp. And then there was the sound that defined the end of the decade and polarized everyone: nu metal. The late 1990s saw the genre absolutely dominate, with producer Ross Robinson's raw, visceral style on the early Korn and Slipknot records. His dry, aggressive, in-your-face sound was hailed as a raw, emotional breakthrough by the younger generation, while being met with fierce resistance from many established metal fans who saw it as not real metal. What often gets overlooked is just how experimental so many of those records were. For instance, Korn's debut in 1994 axed so many conventions of metal production. The guitars were detuned 7-strings, run through unorthodox chains that sounded more percussive than melodic. The bass was distorted, clanky, and pushed forward in the mix, sometimes overwhelming the guitars. Jonathan Davis's vocals shifted suddenly from whispers to sobs to full screaming breakdowns, captured in an unpolished, almost voyeuristic way. And Slipknot's self-titled 1999 album pushed the chaos even further. They layered 9 members with turntables, samples, and extra percussion. And Ross Robinson's production left it intentionally raw and abrasive so that it felt like it could fall apart at any moment. But these choices were not accidents. They were deliberate experiments in stripping away polish. They were trying to capture emotional volatility in its rawest form. Whether you loved it or hated it, nu metal showed that 1990s production was not just about refinement and clarity. It was also about risk-taking and breaking the rule book. And that's why the word peak is the wrong word. The 1990s were not a single summit. They were a supernova. It was a decade of violent fragmentation and chaotic innovation that gave us everything from the organic power of In Utero to the polished punch of the Black Album, the clinical brutality of Florida death metal, the frostbitten atmosphere of Norwegian black metal, and the raw experimentation of nu metal. It was the crucible where the hybrid studio, the DAW, drum samples, and the very idea of DIY recording were all forged. It may not have been the best sounding era, but it was the big bang, the explosive, messy, and brilliant moment of creation that laid the groundwork for everything that came after. Was the 90s truly the golden age? What are some of your favorite sounding and least favorite sounding records of that era? Let me know in the comments. As always, like, share, subscribe. See you next time.